Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be looking at an early piano sonata by Beethoven, his Opus 2 number 1. And in fact we're just going to look at the opening bars of it, and in this we'll discover here's Beethoven writing in this earlier style. He's often known as the bridge composer, bridging the classical and romantic periods. We'll see a little bit about how that's working at this stage in his development as a composer. But I'm also going to give this a particular focus, which might also be of interest to composers. And it's really about how does Beethoven manage to generate a melody from his harmony. So, if you're going to write a piece of music, whether it's in the Beethoven style or in any other style, well, one way of going about it is to think, well, let's get a melody organized and then work out what the chords are going to be that fit that melody. Another way of doing it is to think, well, actually, what are the chords going to be? And then can I use those chords to generate a melody? In a sense, that's what Beethoven's doing here. So we're going to have a look at that in particular. Well, one thing we notice about the opening bars of this piece is there's nothing too complicated about the chords that he's using. It's a sonata in F minor, and in the opening statement of this piece we have a lot of chord 1 and chord 5, 7. That's basically what's going on. There's one chord 2 that's being used, but it's 1, 5 with that occasional 2. That's very classical thinking, kind of simple harmony, nothing overcomplicated, and a texture which is essentially melody and accompaniment. So the melody's in the right hand and the left hand is punching out some chords in the accompaniment. So let me play the first few bars. Okay, let's have a little look at what's going on there. So you can hear that melody in the right hand, you can hear the left hand playing those chords. Let's see what these chords are. First of all, it's quite interesting that Beethoven just starts with a melody on its own. How many times do composers start by thinking, well, what's the first chord going to be? Well, we don't really hear the first chord properly until the left hand plays it there. So we have these first handful of notes as a monophonic statement just in the right hand. Although it's interesting that those notes do spell out a chord. Because when we get to this point and we hear this left hand chord, well, that's very clearly stating an F minor chord. If we're in the key of F minor as we are, it's chord 1 or the tonic chord. Okay, now when we've finished stating that tonic chord, we move on to this chord. Now what's that? It's a C7 chord with E in the bass. So in the key of F minor, that's a dominant 7th chord in first inversion, a 5-7 chord first inversion. And it first gets played there, but it carries on for a little bit longer. And then when we come to this moment, we're coming back to our tonic chord, our chord 1 in F minor, it's the same as that. And then we move on to this chord, which is fairly similar to that one. Actually, it is slightly different because there's no C in it this time. So you might think, well, the C is sort of implied, and the C is there in this little grace note in the right hand. So really that's a 5-7, a dominant 7th in the second inversion. Or if you're thinking, well, I'm not taking the notes of this C, you could say it's a chord 7 in the first inversion. But I do think that C is material. So it's a 5-7 chord again. So it's the same chord as this, but just in the next inversion. Then when we come into the next bar, well, we've got the tonic chord, the chord 1 again. So it's this chord, but this time it's in first inversion. Then here comes our chord 2 in first inversion, before we come to chord 5 again at that cadence. So you can see very clearly spelt out harmony in the left hand, quite slow harmonic rhythm. We have chord 1, then we have this chord 5, then we have chord 1, chord 5, and then it speeds up 1, 2, 5. Not uncommon because we often speed up the rate of harmonic change, what we call the harmonic rhythm, as we approach a cadence. And this is our first cadence. So you notice Beethoven marks it with this rather sort of dramatic moment of silence with the pause on it before he carries on again. That's kind of drama as part of the Beethoven style, and it's there even at this early stage. So that's what we see going on in the chord life. Okay, now above this chord, we've got this melody. Wonderful, wonderful melody. But what's that melody doing? Well, we talked about these notes on their own at the beginning, didn't we? But all of those notes spell out the tonic chord of F minor. F, A flat, C. That's the tonic chord. But what have we got? C, F, A flat, C, F, A flat. So even though that's the melody, it's spelling out the chord. So even though you might think, well, the first chord in this piece comes there, actually, the first chord in this piece comes here, but it's spelt out melodically. So it's one very interesting way of writing. The trouble is, when you're writing a melody, if you spell out chords, you end up bouncing up and down arpeggios or broken chords or something, but you're always writing in leaps as you jump from one note of the chord to the next. So you end up with a melody that can be a bit kind of dislocated because there's not enough stepwise movement. How does Beethoven deal with that? Well, he gives us this opening set of melodic notes spelling out the chord, and then in the second part of that opening melodic phrase he goes by step. So then we have this. Now, how does he do that? Well, you could say this semi-quaver triplet, 16th note triplet, is just some kind of ornament that's been tucked in there pretty quickly. The notes fly by very quickly, but you can justify all these notes in relation to the harmony. So we've got this chord 1 in F minor. There are chord tones, chord notes in the melody. A flat belongs to 1, F belongs to 1, F belongs to 1. So those are the harmony notes or the chord tones. This G here is a passing note or a passing tone, just slipped in by step between A flat and F. So A flat and F belong to the chord, so they're coming out of the harmony again. But by using this passing note or passing tone there, you're able to connect the notes and to go step by step. So it's giving us some of this stepwise motion to counterbalance this leaping disjunct motion. And then this E natural that we get there, it's E natural because it's the raised 7th note in the scale of F minor. That's perfectly normal. But this note, this E natural, is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. So you see what's clever about this. You've got an initial melodic statement. It's just those 2 bars, those 2 measures. And the first half of that is kind of spelling out the chord. And then the second half of it is going by step, still spelling out the chords, but this time using some of these inessential notes, the passing note, the auxiliary note, so that we can get notes that are adjacent to each other. So you couldn't really, well, you could, but you wouldn't perhaps want to write a melody that bounces up and then bounces down again. Doesn't sound wrong, does it? But if you spent the whole piece doing that, you'd probably feel as if you'd been on a musical roller coaster. Yeah, it sounds all right. Sounds quite jolly, doesn't it? But there will come a point where you'll be thinking, oh my goodness, I can't be leaping around anymore. So you see how Beethoven manages to balance the disjunct and the conjunct movement within a very short statement. But the whole thing is spelling out the chord. Now, we know then that the chord changes in the next 2 bars or the next 2 measures, because we've already seen that this is a 5/7 chord, a dominant 7th chord in its first inversion. Well, what are these notes doing in the melody? They're spelling out the chord, because if the chord is C, E, G, B flat, well, what have we got in the melody? exactly those notes. G, C, E natural, G, B flat. So we're spelling out the chord again in exactly the same way we did in the first phrase. And then guess what? Second half of the phrase, same pattern. So we're using these notes next door to each other to create this balancing conjunct movement to the previous disjunct movement in exactly the same way. So we've got a passing note here, we've got a lower auxiliary note there. And then you also realize that, well, what's Beethoven doing here? He's got this short two-bar statement followed by another two-bar statement, and they belong to each other, don't they? Because there's a kind of sequence running between those two phrases. So we have, and then we change the chord and do the same thing again. The only thing that's slightly different is that in the second phrase, we start on the first beat of the bar, the measure, and in the first phrase, we had that anacrusic start, that note before the first bar line. Okay, now, then cleverly, what Beethoven does is he takes this idea of these two-bar phrases and he condenses it simply by taking the second ingredient. So if you like, there are two ingredients, aren't there? The one we talked about, spelling out the chord, followed by this end piece, as it were, where you're still spelling out the chord, but you're using these inessential notes in between. So having done that twice, using two different chords, it then says, well, let's just use the tail piece. So if you look at this, you think, well, it's the same as this, isn't it? It just has this extra little grace note. And then if you look at this, you think, oh, that's the same as that. But what is enabling the whole thing to do musically is instead of spacing out chord 1 over those two bars and then spacing out chord 5, 7 over those two bars, he's now speeding up that rate of change and saying instead of having two bars, we'll have one bar of chord 1 and one bar of the dominant seventh chord. And he's doing that by just using the second ingredient of those phrases and condensing it. So now we've got that one bar thing there and a one bar thing there. So we have, so you see how that works. And then he says, well, we need to round all this off now as we're coming up to the cadence. So as we said, the rate of chord change increases. It's faster harmonic rhythm, where we have this chord 1 in first inversion, followed by this chord 2 in first inversion, followed by this chord 5 here. And he's just melodically finishing off. We've got this little idea at the end, which obviously relates to these triplety things, but he's just written it in a slightly different way and turned it upside down. You notice that all of these are three notes descending. Now we've got three notes ascending. So he's written that in a slightly different way just to turn that around a bit for the cadence, to kind of highlight the cadence. And here he decides, well, let's have a full chord in the right hand. So far, all the way from the beginning to this point, we've just had single notes. Well, let's have a whole chord. So the whole chord is spread to draw attention to it, and all those notes belong to this chord 1 in F minor. So you have that, and the left hand enforces that. So you've suddenly got a lot of notes on the go. You've got 7 notes sounding by the time you get to this point. So it's much kind of thicker than it's been before. And then again, he's using a mixture of notes that belong to the chord and inessential notes to again spell out the chord, but to give us conjunct movement. So we have all of this is conjunct movement. So this is the first phrase we've had where the whole phrase is conjunct movement. So you see how he's doing this, writing a kind of chord scheme, then having a melodic line that's spelling out the chord scheme, and then working out how to get a balance between this disjunct and conjunct movement, working around the chords, but thinking, when am I spelling out the chord in the melody? When am I using inessential notes to create stepwise movement, to create balance? And then he stops. I mean, I think it's one of the wonderful things about this sonata. You know, you sit down all set to hear this great, whole sonata, and you get the first handful of bars, and then it just suddenly stops. Kind of, what's happened? Has the pianist forgotten what's coming next? Little tea break. Oh, right, we'll carry on now. That's a wonderful moment of Beethovenian drama. And then you say, well, okay, what does he do next? Well, isn't this idea what we had in the right hand at the beginning? You know, it was this stuff, but now he's put it in the left hand. So there's a typical Beethoven. He's kind of carrying on with the same idea, but just saying, well, we had it in the right hand, now we'll have it in the left hand. And what's this chord? Well, all this is a chord of C minor. So it's spelling out the C minor chord. Now you might think, oh, I know what's going to happen. At the beginning, we had this F minor chord in the right hand. Then the left hand kind of really confirmed that by playing this F minor stuff. He's going to do the same thing again, isn't he? He's going to go something like this. And put some C minor chords in the right hand. It doesn't actually do that this time. So you notice that even though what was in the right hand is now in the left hand, what was in the left hand is now not in the right hand. He's left it completely unaccompanied for the whole of this statement. So it's fascinating how Beethoven can still spell out the chord without actually completely sounding the chord. And maybe he's kind of set up our ears at the beginning with this treatment. So by the time we get here, we can sort of hear that C minor chord without having the whole chord spelled out to us as a block chord. It's quite clever the way he's done that, isn't it? And it also shows you Beethoven, even in an early work, starting to develop his ideas straight away. You know, the idea that you have a first section called an exposition in a sonata form movement, where we expose the musical ideas, and then you have a development section. Well, you know what? Beethoven does all that, but he says, let's just get developing straight away. So already this idea is being developed in an interesting way. And then you notice what he does next. Well, we've still got our chords present, and they're very kind of solidly here, aren't they? You know, you see all these chords going on for a bar at a time. And then he's got this little idea that, you know, was a kind of incidental idea in the first phrase, but suddenly it's kind of quite important, isn't it? You know, we've had it in the left hand, then we get it there, then we get it here, then we get it there, then we get it there. And suddenly that incidental idea takes on greater significance. Get the chord then, and then we get it in the alto part. Then back in the soprano. Then back in the soprano again. And then he moves on to something that's really conjunct. So it's so conjunct that even the left hand is just using a chromatic scale, going up by semitones or half steps. But all this stuff is conjunct movement as well. And then another phrase of conjunct movement. And then he does a little trick that's kind of the flip side of what he did before. You know, we had this whole phrase, and then he just sort of lifted the end of it. Well, notice what he does here. We've got this ta-di-do-dum, which comes back here. Ya-do-do-dum. But this time he adds something on the front of it. So ta-di-do-dum, ta-di-do-do-dum. So you see these kind of started small and got bigger, whereas previously he started big, got smaller. It's lovely the way he kind of develops things. And then he takes the same thing again and says, I'm going to make it more emphatic now. This is a repeat of the bit we've just heard, but now we'll have it in octaves. So you see the way that even this repetition of the same chords, the same melody kind of builds up. So we get the same kind of pattern 3 times. We get extended, but the same thing. And then octaves and louder. So it kind of makes it really kind of emphatic, doesn't it? Reinforcing that repetition. But the melody is still outlining the chords, even though it's become increasingly kind of conjunct then. And then after that, the left hand gets really busy. So he kind of changes tack in the left hand and thinks we'll have these rolling E flats going on. And you think, what's all this about? Sounds like some kind of pedal point, doesn't it? And then we had this kind of slightly mysterious bit of melody here, but still on this idea, you know, this looks like the opening, doesn't it? But upside down, because we were going up at the beginning, we're doing the same sort of thing coming down. So we get all these E flats, we don't know quite what that belongs to, and then we get... So a kind of slightly darker harmony with those F flats. And the F flat is quite telling because what is it? It's a, you see what that chord is? A dominant minor ninth in A flat major. A flat major is the relative of the home key, F minor. But 5/7 is quite common. You might sometimes find 5/9, but 5 flat 9. So anyone who says, oh yeah, that's the sort of chord you only find in jazz. Well, here's Beethoven writing it in Opus 2, number 1, if you don't mind. So there's a dominant minor ninth hinted out there. Then he comes down the dominant 7th chord, and then he reinforces the minor ninth when he comes to this SF in the next bar. And then he says, oh, that was good, let's hear it again. So he comes down and does it all again to reinforce it. And then he kind of does it again and then starts to come out of it. But again, you see, the left hand is now rolling along with these octaves, doing this kind of dominant pedal point thing in A flat major. But the right hand is still spelling out notes of the chord and kind of making the chords even richer than the left hand suggests, because the left hand is just playing the root of the chord. Well, what else is in the chord? And then Beethoven goes, well, I could just go G and give you the 3rd of the chord, or B flat and give you the 5th, but he goes, no, I'll give you the flat 9. And it's like, whoa, what's F flat doing there on top of those E flats in the left hand? And these are the things that make Beethoven so kind of electric. We're not expecting that to happen at all. Anyway, I hope that's given you an idea as to what's going on at the beginning of this early sonata, but in particular, just seeing how he spins this melodic line out of the harmony and how he manages to mitigate the disjunct movement that generates with conjunct movement alongside it, and how he's just starting to develop all of that even within the first page of the sonata. We could have many a happy hour with Beethoven, but hopefully that's just a useful, helpful insight into the early Beethoven style, and also to those composers who are thinking, how do I get a melody that's going to spin out the chords like that? Well, here's Beethoven, a great master at modelling that for us. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, you might want to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And one of our courses is an analysis of another Beethoven sonata. So you might want to have a look at that and go into real depth as to what's going on in every note and every chord of the whole of the Pathetique sonata. So that's there available to you. Lots of other courses there as well. Or you might be interested in having a look at our Maestros program. Very exciting, lots of opportunities for you there. And so if that's of interest, have a look on our website.